So if there are 10 families living in your property, but one moves out, instead of getting the full $10,000 of revenue for the month, you'll still be getting about $9,000 in revenue while you look for another tenant. But not only is there more reliability with rent with multifamily, even the amount of rent you'll be getting with multifamily will be much greater than you would with single family. Welcome to the Whitecoat Syndicator podcast, where high-income professionals reveal the practical steps on how to buy back your time and build your generational wealth through real estate investing. And now, let's get to today's episode. Welcome to the Whitecoat Syndicator podcast. I'm Dr. Josh Espejo, and we're here to help educate you and other whitecoat and busy professionals know that there's another way to invest in real estate, and that's passively investing through real estate syndications. In today's episode, we're going to cover a topic that's highly debated, and that's whether I should invest in multifamily syndications or if I should invest in single-family homes. Both of these types of real estate investing have a common goal, but there's some key differences which tailor to different investment styles that we'll talk about shortly. And hopefully, by the end of today's episode, you'll have a better understanding of which one will fit you better. And before we get on with today's show, I want to give you a shout out. We're on episode 5 with a total of 20 downloads. I know that's a pretty small milestone to celebrate, but you guys are awesome. If you're enjoying the content so far and getting value out of it, feel free to share this with your family, friends, and anybody else who wants to learn about real estate. So thanks for tuning in. And now, on to today's topic. Before we begin, I want you to know that I'm going to be using the words multifamily and apartment investing pretty interchangeably. Think of an apartment building as a building that houses multiple families. So this word's going to be interchanged a lot. Today, I'm going to break down apartment investing versus single family investing, some of the basic strategies for each, and some of the caveats of each. So hopefully by the end of today's episode, you'll have an idea of which suits you better. First, let's define what a single family investing is compared to multifamily investing, so we have an idea of what we're getting ourselves into. Right off the bat, let's point out that this type of real estate is meant to be lived in. In the case of single family or residential multifamily, these can be homes made for one family, or it can be partitioned into a duplex, triplex, or fourplex. This means that there can be 2, 3, or 4 families under a single roof. And when we say commercial multifamily, we mean something with more than 5 units. But in the case of syndication specifically, we're typically talking about buildings that have 50 units or more. This is because buildings of this size are typically hard to acquire because of the dollar amount. So if you take on private capital, like syndications do, you typically need enough revenue to pay off the investors. So what is a big overall strategy in real estate investing? The general goal is to acquire an underperforming asset, improve it, and gain a profit or increase the revenue from it. I'm sure you've seen or at least heard of those different shows on HGTV, for example, where they flip a house. Say the house looks old or there's some flood damage or fire damage, and they repair it in order to sell it up for a profit. A good rule of thumb is that the more renovated your property is in comparison to properties around the area, the more rent or the higher resale value that your property is going to get. But there's a delicate balance of over-renovating the property, which is possible depending on your demographic. This means that you definitely have to know the market that you're serving and renovate your property accordingly. For example, let's say you're in a high-income A-class area with people who are physicians, doctors, lawyers, people who have a high income. This demographic of buyers typically has a higher standard of living. For example, they might expect higher finishes, things like granite countertops and crown molding along the walls. And typically, they'll pay a premium for stuff like that. But let's say we put the same level of finishes in the blue-collar, more working-class area. When the income for the demographic isn't that high, they're probably not going to pay a premium for those kinds of amenities. So in this situation, it's more economical to pass on the crown molding and to, for example, polish up the countertops. This will keep renovation costs low while also commanding top dollar for the demographic. So now that we have a better idea of the common goal as real estate investors, and that's to improve the revenue of the real estate, and what we need to look out for when trying to accomplish that goal, which again is that over-renovation, let's point out something completely different between the two types of investing. And that's valuation, or how the value of the property is assessed, and the loan type for the bank. First, let's take a look at valuation. We're going to take a look at the valuation method from the banks. Because if a bank values a property at what it thinks it does, it's going to give you the loan. And this usually dictates if you can acquire the property or not. So in my opinion, bank valuation is what makes the value of the property more official. So let's start off with the commercial real estate first. All commercial real estate is valued on what's called an income approach. This means that the value of the building is calculated by getting the revenue of the building subtracted by the expenses, leaving you with their net operating income, or NOI. So with commercial real estate, raising the revenue in any way plays a huge role in raising the value of your property, because this allows you to force the appreciation of the real estate itself. And by forcing appreciation, I mean raising the value. And likewise, every expense that you cut will also raise the NOI. So with commercial real estate, basically, the leaner and meaner that you can get your building running, the higher the value of the building is going to be assessed. So basically, you get rewarded for boosting revenue and cutting expenses. With residential real estate, value is based on what's called the comparison approach. This means that the value of your property is kind of out of your hands. So let's say that you acquired an old rundown house. When you fix it up, comparable to something that was sold for a high dollar value around the neighborhood, the bank is probably going to recognize that, and you're going to get the right price for your property. The downside of this is that if sellers are selling their properties at a discount, your house is also going to be at a discount. A prime example of this is the current times. As of recording, it's October of 2022. Because interest rates are pushing in the 5.5 to 6 range, homes are sitting longer on the market than usual, and sellers are getting more desperate to sell their home. This means that they're willing to sell their properties for cheaper in order to get it sold. But guess what this means for you if you're trying to sell your home or get it refinanced? The value of your property is dropping as well. This also means that if your house is getting a high rent for the area, the bank's probably not going to care too much because it's using the comparative approach. So having a renter or not having a renter doesn't really affect the value of your property. Now that we talked about the valuation differences of multifamily versus single family, let's dive a bit deeper about the differences between multifamily lending and single family lending. One thing that's available for a commercial loan that's not available for a residential loan is something called an interest-only period. This means that for a fixed term of the loan, you're only going to be making some interest payments for the property. This is in contrast to paying principal and interest. In effect, this lowers the mortgage for the property, and thus strengthens cash flow. The next benefit is the ability to have non-recourse debt. But before we dive deeper into this, let's learn what recourse debt is, which is what's used in single-family homes. A recourse loan means that you're personally on the hook for this property. For some banks, it doesn't matter at all if you have a renter in place. What matters is that you personally have the ability to pay for this loan. So the bank looks at you personally, all of your assets, all of your liabilities, your income, everything. And if they deem you as creditworthy, they'll loan to you. But if you can't pay for the mortgage, the bank's going to come after you personally and try to seize your assets. Non-recourse debt, on the other hand, means that the bank only looks at the property income itself. And if it covers the mortgage, they'll make a loan on it. So let's say, for example, you had a property which had 10 units. Each of the renters pay about $1,000 a month, so that's about $10,000 in gross income. After all expenses, before the mortgage payment, let's say you're left with about $8,000. If the mortgage is $4,000, because the $8,000 is about 2 times the mortgage, the bank feels that it's safe enough to make a loan on this property. And worst case, for whatever reason, if you can't make the mortgage payment, the bank will only come after the asset itself. This removes a lot of stress from you as a borrower, because the bank don't care about your income. They care about the income of the property itself, which means that even if you personally couldn't handle the payment of this property, because the revenue covers the mortgage, the bank will still make a loan on it. So this does not affect your ability to acquire more properties. But just to be clear, even though it's a non-recourse loan and the bank forecloses on you, you walk out with 0 consequences. Because your credit's still affected, but the bank's not going to come after you personally, only after the building. So speaking of risk, this leads us into a key advantage of multifamily over single-family investing, and that's income reliability. Let me explain further. Let's say you have your typical single-family home and you have a family renting it out. Well, one day when the family decides to move out, guess what that means? You're 100% vacant. Yes, so even though you budget for vacancy in your assumptions for the property, having a 100% vacant building for a property that you're on the hook for is not a fun feeling. But compare this to a multifamily home. We'll go back to that example of a 10 unit from earlier. So if there are 10 families living in your property, but one moves out, instead of getting the full $10,000 of revenue for the month, you'll still be getting about $9,000 in revenue while you look for another tenant. But not only is there more reliability with rent with multifamily, even the amount of rent you'll be getting with multifamily will be much greater than you would with single family. Back to the 10-unit building with 10 tenants, with each of them paying $1,000 a month, that's about $10,000 a month in gross revenue. Compare that to a single family home where the rent's about $1,500 for that same single family. Even though your rent per unit is greater, because it's a bigger building overall, even though the amount of rent you're getting per unit is greater, the fact that you have 10 families paying comparable rent means that the rent for the multifamily is going to be much greater. All right, guys, we've covered quite a bit so far. Now that we know the typical goals for real estate investing, features of the respective loans, and the amount and reliability of rent for each, we have two more topics left. Hang in there, guys. The last two topics I want to point out are the associated risk of ownership and the time involvement needed for each. First, let's cover the risks involved. When you take on the sole ownership for owning the real estate, whether you're a sole owner or you own it in a joint venture structure, this means that you're held generally responsible for all the aspects of the building itself. You're the one in charge of the building. You need to make sure you're legally complying with everything, that everything is running smoothly for all the utilities, your property monitors are on task and collecting rent, and that the building is safe and nobody gets hurt. And you're on the hook for pretty much everything that can go wrong with the building. I remember the day after I acquired my 3-unit property in Kansas City, I was walking from my condo to the car, and I get a call from my tenant. He tells me that his water was shut off, and it was Friday morning. Guess who was scrambling at work, calling everywhere to make sure that his water was turned on? Because if I didn't get it on that day, that means that he would go the entire weekend without water. And I'd probably have to put him up at a hotel or something. And I had to do the same thing for the two other tenants. These are the kind of unexpected things that you'll have to deal with being an owner of real estate. Not to mention, if somebody actually gets hurt at your property, they're probably going to try to sue you. And potentially, you carry all the liability on your shoulders. Of course, there are strategies to protect yourself from events like this, which we're not going to cover here. But in essence, you're liable for everything with your building. So you're taking all of your risk, and at the end of the day, you receive all your rewards. If everything is managed correctly and your property performs how it should, you're golden. You get all the cash flow, equity, and tax benefits. This is in contrast to being a limited partner on an apartment syndication. As a limited partner, your only duty is to provide capital to the syndication. That's how it's possible to get the benefits of owning real estate, aka the cash flow, equity, and tax benefits, without the headaches of toilets or tenants. In the private placement memorandum that you sign, or the PPM, it painstakingly spells out all of your duties as a private investor. And that duty is to provide capital to the syndication and let the general partners make all the decisions. And since you're putting the decision making into someone else's hands, your liability is only up to the amount that you invested into the syndication. Now, just to be clear again, guys, I'm not saying that there's no risk, because there are still things that can go wrong with the syndication. So you should always do your due diligence before investing, but the only thing on the line is limited to the amount that you invested. But even with that limited risk, you still get to enjoy all the cash flow, equity, and tax benefits. So the last thing we're going to cover today are the time implications for investing in real estate. I don't know about you, but I feel like there's never enough time in the day to get what I need to get done, and let alone everything fun that I want to do. And this is the number one problem that I hear every person talk about, whether it's real estate investing or anything related to life. So while learning every step of real estate investing is important, it's also where most people get stuck and end up not investing at all. Where do you put the time aside to learn all these things? And more importantly, are you actually interested in learning about it? But this is why you're listening to the podcast. You're doing your diligence and learning about real estate investing And for that, I commend you. So that wraps it up for today's episode. You should be up to date with the common goal of real estate investing, as well as key differences in single-family investing versus apartment syndications. For me, I've experienced single-family investing, residential multifamily investing, short-term rentals, and apartment syndications. Each of this is really different in the amount of time that you need to put into each. And at the end of the day, you need to decide which is best in line with what you need, your goals, and your lifestyle. And then passively investing into a real estate syndication, and you want to learn how to reap all the benefits of owning real estate, all the reliable cash flow, equity, and tax write-offs, sign up to our newsletter and get a copy of our new free ebook, The Whitecoat's Guide to Freedom and Wealth Creation, to get to know the ins and outs of passively investing into an apartment syndication and questions to ask to vet your syndicators. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you get notified when the next episode comes out. I hope today's episode gave you guys a ton of value, and feel free to drop questions in the comments. I'll talk to you guys soon. I hope you got a ton of value from today's episode. Don't forget to visit thewhitecoatsyndicator.com to learn everything you need to know about buying back your time through real estate syndications.